Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel and also welcome back to the road to 2000. So, without wasting any time, let's get into the game. On this game, I was playing as black, and then my opponent started with the king's pawn to e4. Then I responded with the Scandinavian defense with queen's pawn to d5, and then my opponent took the pawn. Then I took back with the queen, and then my opponent played knight to c3, and then I played queen to a5, which is the main line of the Scandinavian defense. Here's what you should play when you play the Scandinavian defense. Then my opponent played knight to f3, then I played bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the queen, but this is an inaccuracy. The best move in this position is to play knight to f6, which is a book move, and also playing bishop to f5, which is the best move, but instead I played bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the queen. And then my opponent played pawn to h3, attacking my bishop. Then I went back to h5, or went to h5, which is the best move. Then my opponent played pawn to a3. Then I played pawn to c5, which the computer didn't like. Here the computer liked it if I open up my bishop, but then I played pawn to c5. Then my opponent played bishop to b5 with a check. Then I played knight to c6, which is a great move, and my opponent took my knight, and then I took back with the pawn. Then my opponent played pawn to d3. Then I played knight to f6. Then my opponent played bishop to d5. That was the idea of pushing the pawn to d3. Then I played queen to c7, which is the best move. Then my opponent played knight to e4, looking for the knight exchange, which I did, and then my opponent took back with the pawn. Then I played pawn to e6, but I also like the move rook to d8, pinning the bishop to the queen, but then I played pawn to e6, which is also a best move, a good move, because this opens up my bishop. Then my opponent played pawn to g4. Then I played bishop to d6 because I had to move my bishop. Then my opponent played queen to e2, which is a great move. This opens up the option for king to castle either side. So after that I played bishop to e7. Then my opponent played pawn to h4. In this position I made an inaccuracy and I played pawn to h6. In this position, most time you should play pawn to h5, looking for this pawn exchange, and your opponent can also play pawn here, so it's okay, which is the best move. But then I played pawn to h5, which is not really a bad move, but it's an inaccurate move. Then my opponent played pawn to g5, which is a mistake. This wasted me a pawn, and that's what happened. I took the pawn first, and of course my opponent cannot take back with the pawn because I went the rook. My opponent had to take with the knight, and then I take back with the bishop. Then my opponent played bishop to g5 for taking back with the bishop to g5. Here in this position I played queen to e5, kind of forking the 2 pawns and the bishop, but the computer liked it if I played rook to b8. But the reason I sacrificed my pawn in that position was to play queen to e5 and also win back my pawn. I didn't really sacrifice my pawn, but win a pawn. Then my opponent in this position made the mistake playing pawn to f3. The best move for white is to play rook to g1, protecting the bishop. You are asking yourself, why protect the bishop? Because the bishop is already protected. I'm going to show you why. So in this position, my opponent was thinking maybe I'm gonna take after playing pawn to f3, protecting the pawn in the center, I was gonna take this pawn here, which would have been a mistake, but then I knew what I was doing. I took the bishop. Most people wouldn't take the bishop in this position, but taking the bishop it's not a brilliant move, but it's still a great move. And of course my opponent wouldn't let the queen slide and took the queen back with the pawn, and then I win myself a rook and then another rook. Now we're in the end game, and black is winning comfortably, as you're going to see in this position. After this, my opponent played queen to a6, attacking the pawn on c3. Then I had to play rook to d8 with a check, and then after my opponent moved the king to c3, then I moved my king to f8, which is the best move to avoid the check. and also a fork of a pawn. My opponent first took the pawn on e7, then I played rook to f1, then my opponent took the pawn on c5 with a check, then I had to move my king to g8, which is a great move. Then my opponent played queen to e3, protecting the pawn. Then in this position I just played bishop to h5, attacking that pawn. Of course that pawn cannot move because there's this, so I was winning that pawn either way. My opponent then played queen to b6, attacking my rook. Then just took the pawn with a check, and then after this I moved my rook to d1. The computer liked it if I moved rook to d2, but then I moved rook to d1. Then my opponent played queen to c6, capturing the pawn. Then I played rook to d4 with a check. Then my opponent played king to c5, and then I played rook to d2. Then my opponent played rook to b5, trying not to lose the queen, of course. Then after this I played rook to f2. My opponent then played pawn to e5. Then I played my rook, capturing the pawn on c2 and also attacking the queen. But then my opponent played queen to a8 with a check. Then I moved king to h7, which is the best move. Then my opponent played pawn to g6, and then I took that pawn. And my opponent played queen to e4, hence he sacrificed that pawn with a check. Then I just moved king to h6. My opponent then played queen to a3 with a check. Of course this is not a fork because the rooks protect each other. And then I just moved pawn to g5. Then my opponent played king to a4, which is a huge mistake because this allows the king to be not really pinned but to be cut off, which I did by capturing the pawn on b2. Then my opponent played queen to c5, and then I just played rook to f4 with a check. My opponent moved king to a5, which is the only square. It's not the only move, it's just the only square for the king to move. There's this move, but which the computer says is a good move, but that's made in two. Of course my opponent is not going to sacrifice the queen just like that, and then move king to a5 with it, which is the best move and the only square for the king to move. Then after that I played bishop to e2. My opponent then played queen to f8 with a check. Then I played king to g6. Then my opponent played queen to g8 with a check, and then I made the Nina great move with f5. Not really a bad move, it's a second option. There's also this move because this cuts off the check. Now there are no more checks. But then I moved king to f5. Then my opponent took the pawn with a check. Then I moved king to e4, but there's also the square g4, which is the best move. Now there's this check, the answer didn't like that move. But then I moved king to e4. Then my opponent played queen to d6, and then I moved king to d5. Now there are no more checks. That was I was trying to do the entire time, moving the king away from the queen to avoid any checks so I can play the game. Now it's made in 12, but then my opponent just made it made in 2. My opponent played queen to g5, capturing the pawn and check, and then checkmate. So that's how the game ended, and that's how the game played out. So, which means that sacrificing my queen was a good move. The computer says it was a good move, and I also saw that it was a good move. So don't sacrifice your queen in that position if you're not confident enough to win the game. Sacrifice if you know that you're going to win the game with the remaining pieces, because the queen is not strong alone. The queen needs support. So if the queen is alone and it's moving around the board, there's no threat. The king can just avoid it by moving. So that shows that the queen is not strong enough alone. So thank you for watching. So again, please subscribe, like, comment, and until we see each other on the next video. Thank you for watching. Okay.